In my last video I talked about the original Duck comics licensed by Disney, so I figured this would be a good time to give you my thoughts on the new reboot of Ducktales. First, I would like to address a complaint some people have had about the show. That it shouldn't have been made at all. That it's just another unnecessary reboot. I disagree entirely. For one thing, Ducktales is not the original source material. It was based on a comic book, using characters from animated Disney shorts, some of which debuted in other comics. The point is, these comic books are still being released, and they are not even that obscure either. They are very popular in Europe. In Sweden, they are sold in just about every grocery store, and are easier to find than superhero comics. Ducktales also wasn't the first, nor the last time these characters appeared in animation. So really, why not have them star in a new show? In my opinion, more understandable complaint is the prospect of change.
Dr. Bumby says change is constructive, that different is good.
Different denotes neither bad nor good, but it certainly means not the same.
Yeah, listen to the cat, he knows what's up. But seriously, the new show is, for better or worse, rather different from the old cartoon. Most noticeable is the art style. I'll say that, as someone who grew up reading the comics, I never really minded the way the original Ducktales looked. I was used to seeing these characters drawn by different artists, and their designs in the show weren't that out of the ordinary. Now, many people have complained about the new art style, saying it's not as good as in the original cartoon. Personally, I think it's unfair to compare a 2017 show with one made 30 years ago. Yes, it's been that long. The process of creating an animated series has changed a lot since then. Let's instead compare it with something more recent, which also features Scrooge McDuck. The Mickey Mouse shorts from a few years ago. Honestly, I know many people like them, but I have a hard time getting past these designs. They just seem too exaggerated, more like caricatures of the characters than the characters themselves. With that in mind, the art style in the show seems like a fine compromise. Some feel that the new style is actually closer to the comics, and you might be wondering if that's true. Well, sort of. The characters' slightly skinny proportions are similar to the way Carl Barks portrayed them in his paintings, but the fairly simplistic look with a thick black outline seems to owe more to the style used in Italian Duck comics. Then there is the liberal use of profile shots, which is one of Don Rosa's trademarks. So basically, it's a mashup between different styles. I'm not sure if these are really the best elements to take from each art style, but at least it is based on the comics to some extent. Scrooge's money bin certainly looks different. It's no longer on a grassy hill like pretty much every other incarnation of it, but rather on a small island connected to the city by a bridge. While the purist in me is a bit bothered by this, I have to admit that this is actually a better defensive position. The bin really feels like a castle now. It even has gatehouses. It's also worth pointing out that the new series has more slapstick than the old cartoon did. Again, this doesn't really bother me. Physical comedy was often used in comics by writers such as Al Taliaferro and Don Rosa, the latter of whom was especially praised for his comedic timing. But what about the characters? Let's start with the main attraction, Scrooge McDuck himself, played by David Tennant. Personally, I think he looks fine. That cocky, determined grin is just perfect. Tennant does a great job of playing him too, even if he doesn't sound as old as young. Some have said that he seems too nice, but in the comics it varies a lot from author to author how grumpy he is exactly. And I feel like this show has a pretty acceptable interpretation of him. Of course, there is one character in the show who I just had a very hard time understanding. And I think you all know who that is. That's right, Launchpad. Hur sa? Astronaut's son. Seriously though, as a Swede, I appreciate the shoutout. Then there is Donald, who is now treated more like a great adventurer than he ever was in the original show. But this really isn't a new thing at all. This has been a common portrayal of him in the comics ever since the days of Karl Barks. The idea of giving this incarnation of Donald is incredibly bad luck from the classic animated Disney shorts is nothing new either. This is pretty close to how Donna Rosa portrayed him, and even Barks wasn't afraid of occasionally making him the victim of slapstick. As for Webby and Mrs. Beakley, I have to admit that, given that they weren't actually in the original comics, my reaction to seeing them in the original show was pretty much, wait, who are these people? And now, years later, when I learned that they were coming back from the new show, I thought, oh, they're still around. But anyway, Mrs. Beakley is pretty much the Professor McGonagall of the show. Stern and disciplined, but also kind-hearted and pretty badass. Webby is very knowledgeable and adventurous, but also quite socially awkward and naive. Now, Huey, Dewey and Louie are probably the characters that have changed the most. They now look radically different, both from their old selves and from each other. They have much larger eyes and slightly square-shaped heads, which, granted, I don't really see the point of. I do see why they decided to make it more distinct though. In both the comics and earlier cartoons, Donald's nephews are treated as pretty much free copies of one character. Of course, that was the whole joke, but the creators of this show probably felt it was worth sacrificing for the sake of some individuality. One thing I thought was kind of interesting is that the kids seem to represent different members of the audience. The nephews represent the new, younger viewers, who are unfamiliar with the comics and completely unaware of Donald's adventurous side. Consider Scrooge McDuck to be an ancient character who used to be popular, and whom he has to win over by proving that he still got it. While Webby is the die-hard fan who knows everything about Scrooge and Donald, and is ecstatic about getting to experience more of their adventures. Note that she is the one who tells the nephews about Donald's parents, Hortense and Quackmore, who have never appeared outside of the comics before. Their design seems to be based on the way they looked in Mark Warden's illustrated family tree. Maybe because Don Rose's Quackmore just looks like another Donald with a toupee, which clearly isn't what the creators of the show wanted. And Launchpad is Launchpad. Nothing more to say really. But what about the episodes themselves? Time to talk about the pilot of Ducktales. And yes, I do consider it to be a two-parter. The first one is, as I had already suspected, kinda sort of an adaptation of The Richest Duck in the World. The last chapter of The Life and Times of Scrooge McDuck by Don Rosa. A good choice in my opinion, as it tells the story of Scrooge's first meeting with his great nephews. It's also an interesting decision from the writing team's point of view, as The Richest Duck in the World was released after the original Ducktales ended, and was, at least to some extent, probably deliberately written to distance itself from it. Now, the episode is a loose adaptation to say the least, but it does follow the basic story beats. Scrooge had a falling out with his family years ago, which made him lose his love for adventure and turn him into a bitter recluse who's locked himself up in his mansion. One day, however, Donald and his nephews visit him because of some important matter. In the comics, Scrooge wants to see if they are worthy to inherit his fortune one day. In the show, Donald just wants him to babysit the boys over the weekend. Of course, there's no Launchpad, Mrs. Beakley or Webby in the comic. Don Rosa never really felt the need to feature DuckTales' only characters in his stories. But the part where Webby affirms the nephews that her uncle really is a great adventurer does remind me of a scene from another Don Rosa comic. The Magnificent 7-4 Caballeros, which was, for those of you too lazy to do the math, a sequel to the Disney movie The Three Caballeros, in which Donald teamed up with a Mexican Panchito Pistoles and a Brazilian José Carioca. There were actually plans for them to show up in an episode of the show, but for whatever reason it didn't fall through. One difference between the show and the comic is that Scrooge has only been retired for 10 years, not 30. This means that in this continuity, Donald was already old enough to go on adventures with Scrooge prior to their falling out. I do like the irony that in the comic, Donald refuses to believe that the picture of Scrooge is real, whereas in this episode, it's the nephews who are convinced that the picture of Donald is fake. Also, why would you need to Photoshop a painting? Unlike the comic, there are no bad guys disguised as Santa Claus. I'm guessing David Tennant's had enough of those in his series premieres. Instead, we get several mystical creatures who have escaped from Scrooge's collection of cursed artifacts. My favorite has got to be the Headless Man Horse. It's such a simple and yet utterly bizarre concept. In both stories, Scrooge gets his lust for adventure back after his great-nephews accuse him of being a has-been. His fortune is saved, and he dives down into his money bin while his family looks on in terror, thinking that he's about to die. I do miss Donald's line here though, but maybe that was just a bit too dark even for this show. The second episode is, in my opinion, not quite as interesting, but it's still an entertaining watch. The plot centers around Scrooge and the nephews trying to find the lost city of Atlantis and retrieve a giant crystal from there. A crystal which looks suspiciously similar to the ones from another Disney production about Atlantis, mind you. Anyway, our heroes are pursued by Scrooge's old rival, the now much heavier looking Flintheart Glomgold, who also wants to find the crystal and, in a twist I certainly did not expect, is Donald's new boss. This creates a fun new dynamic between the two which I don't recall seeing before. I always thought it was weird how in the original Ducktales, Glomgold looked absolutely nothing like he did in the comics. Here, he looks even less like his usual self. But I do understand if they wanted to look more distinct from Scrooge. Now, Glomgold was South African in the comics, and was made Scottish in the 80s cartoon. This show seems to combine the two, as he claims to be Scottish, but has been confirmed by the creators to really be South African. Of course, Atlantis did appear in a Carl Barks story too, but the way the city was portrayed was rather different. There were still people living there for one thing, so I won't discuss it in detail. And then finally, we have the ending, where it's revealed that not only Donald but also his sister and the nephew's mother, Della, was an adventurer alongside Scrooge. This is an invention of the show, as in Don Rosa's comic, Della and her brother were just children when Scrooge had his falling out with his family. Here, however, it's implied that the falling out was caused by whatever happened to Della. Perhaps she disappeared on some adventure. And if that's the case, where is she now? There actually was a Dutch comic in 2014, Taktik is Praktik, written to celebrate Donald Duck's 80th anniversary, which explained her whereabouts. I don't know how many elements the show will take from this comic, but they do use the idea that Donald has been raising his nephews since their infancy, which wasn't the case in Al Taliaferro's original comic strips. In my opinion, Day Trip of Doom is the weakest Ducktales episode so far. It's not bad per se, it's just not very interesting. It starts off with the kids playing around with dart guns, which I do like. It's nice that the series showcases their more mischievous side too. Then they go to a playhouse where they are kidnapped by the Beagle Boys, then they escape. The end. So yeah, it's not a very complicated story, but it does have some nice jokes and character development. And I like how the show is setting up its Chekhov's guns well in advance before putting them to use later. The most notable thing the episode does is introducing the Beagle Boys. They have the same names that they had in the 80s show, and are still led by Ma Beagle, with Grandpa Beagle being nowhere to be seen. I've seen some people complain about Burger Beagle's design. I'm not really bothered by it, to be honest. Mostly because I always saw the Beagle Boys as henchmen and didn't care much about them individually. Though I admit that it doesn't make much sense for him to even be called Burger when he isn't fat and is never shown eating. Then we have the Great Dime Chase. I will say that this is where the show gets a little crazy. We get to see in a flashback how Scrooge McDuck earned his first dime as a young shoe shiner in Glasgow. The flashback is drawn in the style of a Carl Barks painting. and is a recreation of a scene from The Last of the Clan MacDuck, the first part of Life and Times of Scrooge McDuck. Of course, this event was first depicted in a 1964 story, getting that healthy, wealthy feeling, by Tony Strobel and Carl Fahlberg. I have to say, I am surprised that some viewers didn't know that Scrooge McDuck was a Scottish immigrant. I mean, he has a heavy Scottish accent, a very Scottish sounding last name, and a first name taken from a famous British literary character. The episode actually has two plots. In the first one we're introduced to Gyro Gearloose, the inventor, who has had a bit of a change in temperament. For some reason, the creators of the show decided to basically turn him into the Riddler.
Now try to keep up with my mind-numbing genius.
Has your primitive brain given up?
I'll show you. I'll show you all!
You'll pay for this, Batman!
Now, there have been a few comics where it does act like this, but for the most part, Gyro's a pretty nice guy, so it does feel like the writers pretty much turn him into a jerk. The plot is that Little Bulb, Gyro's latest invention, goes haywire and tries to steal the #1 dime, and it's up to Louie to stop him without Scrooge catching on. Again, this is a drastic change from the comics, where Little Bulb is Gyro's helpful assistant. Still, on its own merits, it's not a bad story. The other plot shows Dewey and Webby trying to learn more about the former's mother, Della, whose entire life seems to be strictly confidential. I'm happy that the creators of the show went with the name Della from the comics, since her alternate name from the classic animated shorts, Dumbella, was, well, honestly kind of dumb. They meet Mrs. Quackerfaster, who's also rather different from the comics. Originally she was Scrooge's level-headed, well-mannered secretary. Now she's Scrooge's librarian, and also completely insane.
No disrespect the archive!
At the end of the episode we find out more about Della, namely that she used to be a pilot, just like in that story from the Netherlands with a name I will not attempt to pronounce again, and, more importantly, that she actually betrayed her family's trust by taking the Spear of Selene. I'm very curious to see how this plot develops in the future. After that we have the Beagle Birthday Massacre, an episode which doesn't have nearly enough killing in it to justify such a title. This episode is apparently based on the movie The Warriors from 1979. I have to admit that I've never actually seen that film, so I won't be discussing similarities here. Sorry. The story starts off with the nephews going on a boat trip, not bringing Webby along because she doesn't fit in the boat. Is it me, or is the opening to this episode very brown? Seriously, that water looks like mud. Anyway, Webby follows a trail of messages and bottles, which turn out to have been sent by a young delinquent named Lena. She quickly befriends Webby and convinces her to break into what turns out to be Ma Beagle's birthday party, which obviously leads to trouble. I like that the writers really went with the idea from the comics and the old cartoon that the Beagle Boys are a large crime family consisting of various very diverse gangs. I also like this scene where the nephews briefly start talking like their comic book selves.
Well, this usually never happens. This is really weird. Okay, stop talking!
It's long enough to make a point, but still short enough to remain funny and not get annoying. Of course, the big surprise comes at the end, when Lena brings out her enchanted amulet and uses it to contact Scrooge's longtime nemesis Magica the Spell, whom she refers to as her aunt. This means that Lena is actually this show's version of Minima, Magica's niece who debuted in the licensed Ducktales comics, and later made a transition to the Italian Duck comics. Really, we should have known. I mean, an eyeshadow game like that can only be hereditary. Then we have Terror of the Terraformians. This episode starts off with Mrs. Beakley and Launchpad having just taken the kids, including Lena, to see a movie about mole monsters. Webby becomes convinced that there exists a hidden society of creatures known as Terraformians underneath the city, and the gang goes down into the subway to look for them, only to run into trouble. Now, the Terraformians actually debuted in the 1955 Carl Barks story Land Beneath the Ground, where they were in fact two species, the Terras and the Firmins. They were merged into one people in the old Ducktales episode Earthquake. which was an adaptation of that story. After that, he appeared in a couple of other stories and in the Ducktales remastered video game, where their king becomes a boss. With this in mind, it's not very surprising that they turn out to be real, but when they do appear, it's pretty brief. Sure, they help the gang out a bit, but they're mostly just there to prove their existence. Now, if only other cryptids could be that considerate. Come on, Bigfoot, give us a talk show appearance at least. However, the real drama in this episode comes from the interactions between the characters. Launchpad grows increasingly paranoid and maybe a little dumber than usual, thinking that Dewey and later he himself have been replaced by mole monsters. Lena also suffers from conflicting loyalties, having to choose between the well-being of her new friends and the wishes of her aunt, Magica the Spell, played by none other than Catherine Tate. Given that Magica lives on Vesuvius, she's probably as mad at David Tennant for causing its eruption. Oh, and the whole mind wipe thing. Eventually we get a scene where Lena uses her magical powers to save the life of Mrs. Beakley. On one hand, it's a great moment with epic music and a wonderful display of heroism. It's just a bit weird to give it to a character who just showed up in the last episode and was, for all intents and purposes, created specifically for this show. After that, we get the House of the Lucky Gander, in which Donald, nice to see him by the way, it's been a while since he, appeared in the show, reluctantly visits his cousin Gladstone Gander at a casino, along with Scrooge and the kids. Now, Gladstone is a character I think they pulled off very well. I like his suit and his cocky attitude. It's a bit strange to see a duck with big black eyebrows, and he doesn't really sound like I expected him to, but other than that, he's pretty much perfect. Of course, that's exactly why Donald hates him so much. He's the guy who's gotten everything handed to him throughout his life, while Donald had to work hard for far less. The interactions between them are great, and feel as though they were taken straight from the comics. Other than that, the episode doesn't feel like it has much going for it. That is, until it's revealed that Gladstone has actually been imprisoned in the casino by that scientist guy from the Jurassic Park movies, who is actually a demonic luck vampire who has conjured up everything and everyone else in the building using playing cards. I admit, I did not see that coming, though I did wonder why that tiger was green. So the villain, whose name is Toad Leo High, sets up an obstacle course, where Donald and Gladstone are forced to compete against one another. If Donald wins, the gang is free to go, but if Gladstone wins, they are all forced to stay. This is where I have a slight problem with the episode. I mean, yes, it is established that Gladstone is extremely lucky and Donald isn't, but I think it's too easy to interpret the scene as just Toad cheating to ensure Gladstone's victory. But in the end, Donald prevails against all odds, which, as Gladstone points out, really was the luckiest thing that could have happened to him as well. Gladstone gets a luxury cruiser for $20, and the rest of the gang gets to see a very anticlimactic golden cricket. On to the next episode, the infernal internship of Mark Beeks. So the story starts off at the Billionaires Club, where Scrooge and Glomgold's staring contest is interrupted by the arrival of up-and-coming tech industrialist Mark Beeks, a new character created specifically for the show.
Old guys, nice clubhouse you've got here. Got a real I'm so rich I don't care how I look quality about it.
Well then, they had a comic-accurate Gladstone Gander in the last episode, and they've already managed to introduce someone more annoying than him. I'm honestly kind of impressed. Scrooge and Glomgold are having none of his crap, but Huey and Dewey eat it up and ask him for a job. So he takes them to his office and sets up a contest to see which one of them will get it. On one hand, I feel like this is an episode which might become rather dated in a decade or so. But then again, social media is such a big part of our lives today that leaving it out would be like making a show set in the 80s and ignoring the existence of television. However, things turn ugly when a hired thug named Falcon Graves, another original character, shows up to steal Beeks' secret project. Or at least they would if Beeks was the least bit concerned about it and didn't just treat it as an opportunity for some free publicity. But eventually it's revealed that there was no secret project, and that Graves had secretly been hired by Beeks himself so that he could claim it had been stolen. Graves isn't happy about this, which is understandable. I mean, the first time you watch the episode, Mark Beeks' nonchalantness just seems like a character trait. But in hindsight, he practically spent the entire story trolling Graves. Really, the biggest mistake Beeks made was hiring a real industrial saboteur. He should have hired an actor who was in on the plan from the start. Speaking of plans, Flintheart Glamgold spends the episode plotting to kill Mark Beeks in the most hilariously over-the-top way possible. But it never really amounts to anything. Or does it?
Ooh, an invite to a billionaires convention on a yacht. Awesome town, population, Beaks.
And then we get the biggest and most shocking reveal in the entire show so far. Glomgold's beard is fake! Ah! And finally, we have the living mummies of Tough Ra. Honestly, this episode feels like one long tribute to the original Ducktales series. With Scrooge, Launchpad and the kids going on a treasure hunt in some ancient pyramids. Even Scrooge's greed and stinginess feel emphasized here compared to other episodes of the show. Now, the titular living mummies are just that. Normal living people dressed up as mummies. They are members of a hidden, isolated society who have been living in underground crypts for thousands of years. Though how they learned English, not to mention modern lingo, is anyone's guess. They are serving their so-called immortal god king Tough Ra, who is actually a puppet controlled by the high priest. Our heroes manage to convince them to rise up against their pharaoh. It's kind of like a cross between Stargate and Metropolis. As it turns out, their motivating factor isn't the promise of freedom, but rather the promise of burritos. This kind of reminds me of the Carl Barks story Tralala, also adapted into an episode of the classic Ducktales series, where the inhabitants of the eponymous valley have no interest in money, but become obsessed with bottle caps. In the end, however, Tough Ra turns out to have been a real undead mummy all along. He had just been sleeping for a few millennia. This is a nice twist, but I feel like the creators of the show kind of gave it away by having Tough Ra chase the gang around in the opening credits of the show. In the end, Tough Ra is defeated by his servants, so turn him into a burrito. Yes, really. And all is well that ends well. So that's our first batch of Ducktales episodes. What do I think about them overall? Honestly, I've really been enjoying them. Ducktales is probably one of the best reboots out there right now. As for how they compare to the comics, I think the thing they've captured the best is the comedy, which works really well. I would have liked to see more of Donald and Scrooge themselves, but given that the latter's old flame, Goldie of Guilt, has been announced to make a future appearance, that is almost a guarantee. Now, there will be one episode released for Christmas, and then more coming the next year. I have to say that I'm looking forward to it. So until we meet again, I really need a catchphrase.
Who's pushing the plates, Huey? Who's pushing the plates?
Friend, you are crazy!
Who still uses a flip phone?
I'm a pilot, you know, and someday I'm gonna fly away from this place.
We are going to die!
Don't turn your back, don't look away, and don't blink.
You think you're about to achieve enlightenment. The pearly gates of knowledge are opening up, and all the secrets of the universe are about to be revealed.